Hey everyone, it's Jessie from b.a.r.e Flower Farm. If you're new to my channel, I'm a first-year cut flower farmer growing in Zone 6B in New Jersey. And typically I focus my videos on the business aspect of flower farming for those first to second, third year cut flower farmers. Now, today I have a very on-key topic. I wanted to talk about tulips and specifically whether tulips can be profitable for you. And the answer is a resounding yes, but I'm going to talk about why they could be profitable and why they could not be profitable. But I think if you play your cards the right way, they're definitely a very, very profitable crop, even from my limited experience alone in year one. So there are a few things that I'm going to cover in today's video. So first, I am going to talk about why I love tulips from a profitability standpoint, and also the fact that they are very, very pretty. The second is the downsides of growing tulips, including the cost piece of it and things that you need to consider that might change the profitability equation. The third thing I want to talk about is how much money should you be paying for a single tulip bulb, and how much money can you realistically charge for a bouquet of tulips and by a per stem calculation in order to make money. The fourth thing I want to talk about is considerations you need in order to grow tulips. You've probably heard some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about, but I am going to hammer those home, because if you don't have certain types of infrastructure, you are setting yourself up for failure. And then last but not least, I will talk about my plan for 2023. So let's dig in. One thing I do want to clarify is that in my last tulip video, I talked about soil forcing and hydroponic forcing. I'm actually going to take those out of the equation today and just talk about growing tulips in the field, what that looks like. Obviously, I'll talk a little bit more about the soil forcing and hydroponics in my plan, but let's just assume that you are planting tulips like you normally do in a field. So let's get started as to why tulips are my favorite from a profitability standpoint. The first is that they are relatively low maintenance. So tulips, if you didn't know, really need a cooling period, meaning that you need a winter to get them to grow to the adequate stem length that you need. If you live more in a southern climate, like, we'll say like in Florida, Texas, Southern California, when you buy bulbs, you need to buy bulbs that are pre-cooled by the supplier, or you can put the bulbs in your refrigerator. But for those of us who have a legitimate winter where the temperatures are going below 40 degrees for at least, you'd say 12 to 15 weeks, we can grow tulips naturally, right? So the greatest thing about tulips is that you can mass plant them. So I'm going to show a photo over here. This is a photo from a farmer who specializes in tulips. She specializes in forcing tulips in crates and that kind of stuff, but she also does some field planting. And so in one of these little areas, one of these boxes, we'll call it, she can fit 1,200 tulips. So it gives you an idea for how closely you can space tulips. If you have never grown tulips before, look up the egg carton method. Basically, you're just stacking all the bulbs in a clump together. They're not touching each other necessarily, but they're really, really close to each other. So the nice part about tulips is that you get to mass plant them. Some people just throw the bulbs into the ground, and it doesn't matter if the root side is facing downwards or upwards, the tulip will eventually find its way. So, mass plantings, low cost in terms of labor from a planting perspective, from a maintenance perspective. The third thing is that tulip bulbs technically don't need fertilizer. So there's a lot of people out there who say, oh, like put some bulb fertilizer in the planting area. Tulip bulbs don't need it. All of the nutrition that comes from the tulip is within the bulb. So, you can technically plant it in sterile soil, hypothetically. This is assuming that you don't want the tulip to regenerate and you're treating it as an annual. And that is another assumption that I'm making here, is that we are treating a tulip as an annual. The bulbs basically either get pulled out when you're harvesting, or you're just going to not use the bulbs for next year. And the reason is because typically, when you're harvesting the tulip, you're probably taking the leaves with it, or you're trying to get the extra couple of inches with the bulb. When you pull it out, it's just not going to regenerate in the way that you need it to regenerate for the same quality that you need in order to sell as a cut flower. Now, if you were to put these bulbs out in your landscaping and not cut them, touch them, totally fine to keep them as a perennial. But as a cut flower farmer, we're treating these as an annual. So the other thing I love about tulips is this ability to program them. So that's in the context of hydroponic forcing in crates. But the other thing about tulips is that you have the ability to quote unquote hold them for weeks when they are at that right stage of bloom. That right stage at bloom is this closed head with color peeking out. And if you can harvest at that time, you can keep it for weeks up to a month in a cool refrigerator or cooler. So there's a lot of flexibility that you have in terms of deploying blooms out. So let's say you have, multiple events, or you have multiple people who want to buy from you, but not in the same week. You can hold those tulips. And what I also love about tulips is that when you store it, you have basically 4 different ways to store it. You could store it wet, you could store it dry, like wet meaning in water in a bucket. You could store it dry, you could store it without the bulb, you could store it with the bulb. So there's a lot of different ways to just, skin the cat in this case, right? All of that matters for me because there's a lot of flexibility in terms of the storage piece of it, which is important to me. But more so, the labor piece of it is relatively minimal compared to some of the other flowers that we grow out there, right? So I love the fact that I don't need to do any maintenance, especially in my climate. We get enough snow. Tulips are water loving flowers, so you do have to make sure that you give them a good drink in the beginning, but typically nature takes care of the rest. All right, so as with every pro, there is also cons out there, right? So let's talk about some of the cons of planting tulips, especially when it comes to profitability. I think that the first is what I already mentioned. You're treating these as an annual. Now, when you compare the cost of a bulb versus a seed, a bulb is going to be, multiple times, like 100x times more expensive than a seed. And so we're going to get into the economics of this later, but the recognition is that you're probably going to pay a decent amount, anywhere from like 30 cents to sometimes up to $1 for a bulb. And how much are you selling this stem for, right? Versus like you get something like a zinnia and the seed is literally cents and you have multiple stems to harvest off of, versus for the tulip, you only have 1 stem. But I'm still going to talk about why I think it works. The other thing is that you do need a certain amount of space in order to plant tulips from year to year because of them being susceptible to certain types of diseases. And what I mean by this is that, like most plants, you should be rotating where you are planting them. But for tulips, you should not be planting them in the same spot until 7 years later. So if you are planting a lot of tulips, we're talking about like over 5,000-10,000, and you have a relatively small space, you might start running out of space after like year 2, year 3, right? So just something to put into consideration there. You really should avoid planting tulips in the same spot. It is just not worth gambling. Because you could lose your entire crop. So, you could literally lose hundreds of thousands of dollars in what you invested in the bulbs because of disease, right? So tulips and diseases are something that is definitely top of mind for me. The other con is that I kind of touched upon this, but the tulips do need to achieve a certain amount of cooling time. And this is a little bit more relevant for people who live in those more moderate climates where you may not get such a cold winter, but you still have a winter, right? And the implication here is, if you take a step back, there's 2 factors that really control whether or not your tulips are going to get enough cooling time. The first is the weather itself, but the second is how early did you plant them? So typically for where I live, tulips go into the ground sometime in like mid-October, mid to even late October. Last year, I actually even planted out in late December and I was fine, but that is not something I would do on a mass scale. So for those of you who live in maybe like a North Carolina or something like that, you want to make sure that you're aware of your weather in the winter and trying to maximize getting them in when the soil is still loose enough to work. So a lot of people think that after the first frost, you can't put in tulips. That's absolutely false. As long as you can work the soil, you can put in tulips. We've gotten a couple of weeks of frost at night by now, and I am still putting in tulips. tulips. So, and it's because I live in a climate where, you know, we have a heat wave right now, which is ironic, but typically, you know, I'll get down to that 40-degree weather at night, really consistently in late November, early December. So I still have a lot of time, in my view, a few weeks to put in tulips. I would say for me, I would try to get them all in by Thanksgiving. So again, I'm in zone 6B in New Jersey, but for everyone, it's gonna look different. You just wanna make sure that you allow for that 12 to 15 weeks of cooling time, because if you don't do that, what's gonna happen is you're gonna end up with very short stems, which become kind of unusable unless if you're gonna put them in like a mason jar or something like that. I need to check on my dog right now. All right, he's fine. He saw a truck, so he started barking. So to finish out the downsides of tulips, there is also this downside that they are a magnet for deer, voles, creatures that just love bulbs. So if you are in an area where you don't have protection like fencing from deer or from voles, you want to make sure that you are putting in the precautions to not have those get eaten. And I've seen anywhere from pepper harrow basically buying like restaurant quantity paprika, putting it into the mulch and soil on top of the bulbs. That seemed to work for them. I don't know if it's actually going to work over the long term, but obviously a fence is the best deterrence for a deer, or even like netting around. But for a vole, I've seen people put chicken wire on top and basically letting that chicken wire stay until the tulip bulbs or the tulips start blooming in the spring. And that typically deters critters from getting from the top. And then when they're planting, before they put the compost or soil down, they also have some chicken wire to prevent the voles from coming upwards. So I think actually chicken wire on top is to prevent like squirrels and stuff from eating the bulbs. But definitely a consideration if you live in an area with a lot of pressure on that kind of stuff. Last but not least, this is probably actually the biggest con of tulips, is that they have a really short harvest window once they start blooming, especially when the temperatures skyrocket. Like anything above 70 degrees, I find the tulip bulbs just start blowing open. We had a day here where it was like 85 degrees, and it was astounding how quickly those heads just blew open. You know, the day before they were like still not close enough to be harvested, and boom, you know, they blow open. And the problem is, once they blow open, you've now significantly reduced your vase life that you have with them. So, you know, tulips are not necessarily known for having the longest vase life, but if you harvest at the right stage, you know, you're usually able to give your customers about at least a week of vase life, right? That's assuming that you're harvesting at the right stage, you're keeping it cool when you're storing it, if you're storing it, and then the customer is taking care of the tulips by not putting it in a warm, sunny spot. That is actually always the number one thing I tell customers is, please make sure that wherever you put the tulip vase, that it is not next to a sunny window. Tulips are cool weather loving crops. Make sure that the water is extra cold. I even add an ice cube into that water, right? So to the extent that you can keep the tulips cool, you are able to extend the vase life of your tulips. And some of my customers came back telling me that their tulips lasted for 10 days. So it's something where I think the care on the customer side really can add a few extra days to their vase life without them knowing it. But going back to this harvest piece of it, right? So, you know, if you're leasing land, if you're planting somewhere else where it's not easy to get to, you know, that's something that you want to consider, especially once you start realizing that the tulips are blooming. You know, tulips are the type, like they're kind of like sunflowers, where you go out in the morning and they're still a little too early to harvest, and you go out in the afternoon, it's like, bam, I have to harvest them right now. And your ability to harvest at the right time completely determines how long you can hold those blooms for, right? Because remember, you are going after that tightly closed color peeking out stage, because then, you know, the tulip will do its job blooming in the vase. So another consideration for you there. I think this is a section that a lot of you are probably waiting for in this video, and it is, how much should you expect to pay for bulbs, and how much can you realistically expect to charge for them? So let's talk about how much you should be realistically paying for bulbs. I'm gonna start out by saying that tulips are a mass volume game, right? So anything that has a higher cost base, right? So a bulb is more expensive than a singular seed. It is typically a volume game. So you should be thinking about planting at least a few hundred. In my view, when I do the calculations, and I'll show you, 500 is a good minimum number. And just from what I showed you earlier, it's not hard to fit 500 into a very small area, right? So space usually is not a limitation for that. It's usually how much can you spend to acquire the bulbs, because let's just say that you're spending at the low end 30 cents a bulb, right? You're already spending $150 for 500 bulbs. Now, $150 gets you a lot of seed, right? $150 can get you almost a season's worth of seed if you're a smaller flower grower. So the question there is, is it worth you selling 500 stems versus 500 stems of something else that could also be cut and come again, right? So those are all things that you need to weigh in. But assuming that you have the ability to do at least a few hundred, in my book, at least 1,000, you really should not be paying, or you should be paying between somewhere around like 30 cents to 60 cents a bulb. In order to get these pricings though, you need to have a wholesale account, right? So you need to have usually an EIN number. You might need to have a resale tax certificate, especially for certain states. There are states out there that don't charge sales tax, so that doesn't matter. But a resale tax certificate basically says to the wholesaler, do not charge tax on me right now, because when I sell to my customers, will charge tax on them, and then I'll pay the state tax, so that you're not getting charged twice. So in order to go through a wholesale channel, typically you need to be a more, we'll call it a legitimate business, having gone through that paperwork. And, being a legitimate business has nothing to do with how many employees you have, even how much revenue you bring in. You can be at a loss and still be a legitimate business. You just have to fill out those forms. So this is really important though, because if you don't go after a wholesale type of arrangement for acquiring your bulbs, you're going to be paying out the wazoo. I mean, there are bulbs that are being sold like $1 to $1.50 a bulb. If you're going to be spending that much on a bulb, I would actually say that tulips will not be profitable for you, and you should not go after that. If you want to plant it for your own landscaping and enjoy them, that is a different story. But tulips, in order to be profitable, really should be, I would say at the high end, 60 to 70 cents a bulb maximum. The majority of my bulbs this year were around the 37-cent mark. And that actually includes the pre-cooling for the majority of them. So typically the cooling of the bulbs in a cooler is at no extra cost to you as a customer, which I was kind of surprised about. But I did end up buying some bulbs later on from the workshop that I took, because they were able to source in very special varieties that a lot of the brokers can't get. So I ended up paying, I think it was like 50 cents to 53 cents per bulb there. And that was also to support them too, because the more demand that they have, the more they're going to be able to ship, the more they're going to be able to drop their price in the future. I just wanted to make sure that they knew that there was a demand out there. And I know that a lot of other students taking the workshop with me were equally as excited too. So I'll talk a little bit more about my plans later. But yeah, so from a cost perspective, we're talking about anywhere from like 30 to 60 cents a bulb. So I want to show you an Excel spreadsheet that I started doing, because this is going to help us transition into, well, how much can you realistically charge per stem? So let's look at this Excel sheet. And what I did was I assumed that, we're going to start off with 500 bulbs. So I feel like for a lot of people that is a realistic goal. It might feel a little intimidating, but it is realistic. And I'm going to assume that when you sell tulips in a bouquet, you're selling 10 in a bouquet. This is just for simplicity of numbers for us to do math. So if you have 500 bulbs and you're selling 10 per bouquet, that gets you to 50 bouquets. And this is important because this is how we're going to calculate profitability and margin, all that stuff. And of course, I cannot not talk about labor. So I'm going to be generous here and say that for 500 bulbs, it's going to take 10 hours, which I think is actually above what you would need. 500 bulbs typically comes in a single crate. And I would say that if you are efficient in how you're planting, so even if you're doing the trench method where you have to dig up an area, some people do a no-till method, which basically eliminates the need to dig up the trench, but you do need a shovel and compost on top. Regardless of the two, it really shouldn't take you more than a couple of hours to plant and dig that trench for 500 bulbs. I'm adding in a little bit of time for like, you have to get it watered in the beginning and stuff. And then I'm adding more time on the back end for harvesting, because if you're harvesting in soil that is not super loose, you have to dig up the bulb. Then there's the processing of it where you have to strip the leaves and, clean the leaves if you're leaving any leaves and there's still dirt on there, right? And then you have to bundle them up. So I'm going to say for 50 bouquets, you're going to spend 10 hours. And I always put $15 on the hour for my time. So that gets you to $150 for your labor assumption. You can always play around with these numbers, but I'm trying to be a little bit more conservative with the calculations here. So what I then did was I priced out what would profitability look like, or how high can you go in terms of cost per bulb, depending on how much you're selling each stem for before you break even, right? Like, what is that middle ground where you're gonna operate at a loss versus making money, given what I just talked about, especially with the labor assumption. So I have in 10-cent increments what this looks like for if you purchase a bulb on the very, very low end, 20 cents. Like, I'll be honest, I have not heard of anyone really getting anything at 20 cents today because of inflation and just the demand for bulbs in 2022. I haven't seen anywhere near 20 cents in the orders that I was looking at for 2023, but I'm putting it out there because there are some bulbs that go on discount, right? Massive discount. So we have 20 cents, 30 cents, 40 cents, all the way up to $1 per bulb. So in the first table that I have over here, I'm assuming that you're selling each stem for just $1, which is on the low end, I'm going to preface by saying, but let's say that you sell each stem for $1. You're putting 10 stems in a bouquet. So that gets you to $10 a bouquet in revenue. Now, times 50 bouquets, which is the opportunity that you have, and then minus the cost and the labor of the bulbs, right? Because the bulbs would have cost you, in this case, you'll see in this column for, we'll call it the 500 bulbs at 20 cents, that would cost you $100 plus the labor of 150 gets you to 250, right? So the labor here is what we call constant. It doesn't change, but obviously the cost per bulb will impact the cost related to the bulbs here. And that's how I get the cost and labor column. So now you can see the profit column. And really where you break even is at 70 cents a bulb. So even at that high end of 70 cents, which is something I probably would not buy a bulb at, you are able to break even while selling for a very low cost $1 stem, assuming you're selling this, in the 10 bunches of bouquets, right? And then let's say you sell out of everything, let's say that you are able to get a more realistic price of 40 cents a bulb, then you are able to make $150, assuming you sell out all your bouquets, right? So what I did was I then repeated this exercise for what I feel are more realistic numbers in terms of what you could sell for. And I would say that it is very reasonable, assuming that you are growing specialty varieties. We'll talk a little bit more about specialty varieties after, but assuming you're growing specialty varieties, for you to charge at least $2 a stem. So that looks like is 10 stems in a bouquet for $20. That is really reasonable because remember, you're not buying small bulbs, right? A lot of people think about, hey, the grocery store is literally selling a bunch of tulips for like $2, $3. Like, how can I compete against Trader Joe's? And I will say that, the size of the bulb, with most plants really does dictate the size of the head that you're going to get for the tulip. So when you're buying tulips, you're typically not buying those very small bulbs, right? So not only are you producing a bigger plant or head for the customer, but you're also giving them variety that they typically don't see in the grocery store, especially once you start getting into like parrot territory, doubles territory, fringe territory, right? So those are all things that, you need to consider as to why it increases the value of what you are offering to your customers. So $2 is like, I believe can be done in most markets. And I'll talk about how I was able to prove that in my market after. But if you repeat this exercise for $2 a stem, you basically more than break even if you're paying $1 a bulb. So you're making anywhere from $350 to $750 in profit, assuming you're growing only 500 bulbs. Let's say you're growing 1,000 bulbs, right? Double what I just said. Now your range goes from $700 to $1,500, right? This is what I'm saying. Tulips are a volume game because the time it takes for you to mass plant is really, how do you say, like disproportionate to how much money you'll make, in the sense that it is less labor intensive to plant, right? The harvesting is a different story, but at least the planting piece of it is relatively easy. Now, at my first farmer's market, because I had just moved from my townhouse to where I am right now growing, I obviously didn't have any tulips because I didn't plant anything in October. I did plant some tulips in my townhouse, but we're talking about like, I think it was like 50 tulips, right? Maybe 80. So nothing significant enough for me to sell at a farmer's market. But I had taken the tulip workshop back in, I think it was February. So I had about a month's worth of tulip knowledge. I'd never grown tulips before, by the way. I've never sold tulips. I've never sold any kind of flower for that matter. But they talked about pricing in that workshop. And that was really helpful for me because what I did was I found a local farmer with very similar growing philosophies as me in terms of growing sustainably, being a small grower, that kind of stuff. I purchased stems from her. So these are tulips that have already been grown. They were harvested at the right stage. They were put into a cooler for me to pick up. And I bought 200 stems from her, intending to basically prove whether or not I had a market and whether or not I could charge the amount that the Tulip Workshop recommended, or that they were charging basically, right? And one thing to note is that the two facilitators of the workshop live in relatively rural areas. They do live in the Northeast. One is in Vermont and one is in upstate New York, but they are relatively rural. I mean, I drove up to that farm in Vermont and it is rural. So the fact that she was able to get basically, $2.50 a stem or a bulb on the customer end, she's selling wholesale, right? So she's not getting $2.50 a stem, but ultimately the customer is paying $2.50 a stem, which is the number that I care more about. I was like, I should be able to get that around here in New Jersey where, income is relatively higher for where we live. And even though it's a little bit more rural, it's a lot more populated, right? So I bought 200 bulbs and I'm going to put on here what exactly I bought. This was a mix of doubles, of parrots, and of singles. Now, even the singles were really massive. I had customers coming back to me being like, I had no idea how big a tulip bulb could get when it opened. So that was really cool to hear. And what I did was I mixed them because you can see from a per stem perspective, it ranged anywhere from $1.20 a stem. The $1.20 is a salmon and apricot impressions. Those are the single type varieties. And it went all the way up to $1.70 for the apricot parrot, which is this, it's so hard to describe, but put a photo up here and it's just majestic. And when it opens, it doesn't even look like a tulip, right? So people were just fascinated by what this thing was. So even paying up to $1.70 for that kind of variety, I balanced having at most 2 parrots. I had, I think it was like 3 singles and then like a Vogue, which was, the Vogue and the Avant-Garde, I believe, were doubles. So I just had a mix in there. And it averaged out to $1.38 a stem. And I actually didn't do 10 stems in a bouquet. I did 8 stems in a bouquet for $20. And that's how I got to $2.50 a stem. I had 24 bouquets total that were made because I broke a couple of stems while I was harvesting or while I was making the bouquets. And I was able to sell 22 bouquets. So I was able to bring in $440 of revenue. And when I take out the amount that I paid for the tulips, which was $275, that left me with $165 of profit. So he's laughing because it's like, the grower assumes most of the risk, right? And then the only risk that I assumed was whether or not I could sell them. And, just that 24-hour affair where I picked up the tulips, I made them into bouquets, and I sold them at a market. I made $165 right there, right? So right then and there proved to me that tulips, well, first I had a market for tulips, that people were willing to pay $2.50 a stem for tulips, which honestly I would never have priced that had I not taken that class. And it proved to me that people went gangbusters because this was May 1st. This was like very early spring. No one else had flowers at the time. And even though it's May already, it was just people were desperate for flowers and they loved the color combination. So what I found was that, I'm gonna try to sell between the $2 and $2.50 mark range. And then on Valentine's Day, it's gonna go above $2.50. But let's quickly look at what this table looks like if it is $2.50 a stem. From the low end of profitability, you're making $600 off of 500 bulbs. And on the high end, you're making $1,000. So again, double the amount that you're growing to 1,000 bulbs. Now on the high end, you're able to make $2,000, and on the low end, $1,200. Realistically, because when I average out my bulbs, it'll probably come out to about 40 to 50 cents a bulb when I include shipping. I'm gonna make anywhere from $850 to $900 in profit for growing 500. And I'm gonna try to grow 10x that. My goal is to do 5,000 next year. So let's actually talk about that now. Let's now talk about what that 10x looks like. So specifically, I want to talk about what I ordered for 2023, who I ordered from, quantities, cost, and just the rationale. Because at the end of the day, we're all buying specialty bulbs for the most part. I know there are some people out there who kind of stick with the singles, and that's totally fine. But for me to get that $250 a stem range, I do need to mix it up a bit with some specialty types. But, in a bouquet of 8 or 10 stems, I don't need all of them to be parrot. I don't need all of them to be doubles, right? We know that the cost per bulb for each of those types of tulips is a lot higher. So you balance it out by ordering more singles, right? So in a bouquet, you might have like 2 doubles, 2 parrots, and 4 singles, and it still looks magnificent. So let's dig a little bit more in there. Now, I want to talk about 2 things. I want to talk about first who I ordered from. So I ordered from, we'll call it 3 suppliers. I ordered from b.a.r.e, who is also who I got my ranunculus corms from. I ordered from b.a.r.e, and we'll call the third one the Tulip workshop. So that's the workshop that I attended, and I talked about how they were sourcing pre-cooled bulbs for their students, especially varieties that we can't get our hands on elsewhere. And after the workshop, I actually bought some bulbs that were not pre-cooled. So when I ordered bulbs, one of the things that I was very diligent about was making sure that I could get some cooling time with these bulbs. Because again, for part of my plan for next year, I am planning on doing some forcing in soil in crates, as well as hydroponic forcing. And I talked earlier about tulips needing their time in cold. So I need to be able to artificially provide cold to these bulbs, and that usually comes in the form of refrigeration. So for a lot of these suppliers, they will hold these bulbs in cool storage for you. They just hold it at different durations. Sometimes the bulbs all come from abroad at different times, right? So it's just something that you need to figure out with your broker if that's something that's important to you. But then the second piece of the equation was I brought from different suppliers, not only because I wasn't sure if I would get all of what I wanted to order. So for example, I still haven't gotten I would say 3,300 bulbs right now, because 3,000 I got from b.a.r.e. I actually haven't even been able to get in touch with them. It's a really busy time of year, so they haven't really been responding to my emails or phone calls. I totally get it. They're really great about the ranunculus corms. They shipped right on time. So they're supposed to get to me on November 19th with cooling that started in August. So I only need to take them another few more weeks in order to do force planting, and I'll basically plant about half of those in the field. So that's b.a.r.e. I ordered my b.a.r.e. bulbs, which were a bit more expensive because they only came in 100 bulb increments for the pre-cooled bulbs, but I am getting them in early January, for the purpose of forcing them hydroponically in February, right? So I'm trying to stagger my bulb my bulb receiving, because I want to make sure that they're still getting the cooling time, and I don't have enough storage space here in order to cool my bulbs. In fact, I only have a normal refrigerator, so I'm still trying to figure out the logistics here. But I scheduled those for them to arrive then, and then I ordered I ordered a total of 2,000 bulbs from the Tulip workshop. I picked up 1,000 after workshop. They were not pre-cooled at all. So some of them are in the field, some of them are in my refrigerator, some of them are in crates outside. It's a little bit of experiment there, but the pre-cooled bulbs will actually be coming, another 1,000 of them, basically in mid-November, and those will start going into the hydroponic forcing immediately because they will basically have all of their cooling done by then, right? So for me, it's really important to understand how much cooling time the bulbs have gotten, as well as just, when they're coming, for me to manage the logistics of forcing. But for most other people, if you're going out in the field, that's not a consideration. So let's talk about the varieties that I've bought. I'm going to put them on a screen right over here, and you can see I do have a combination of doubles. So Columbus is one of the doubles that a lot of people love to grow. Foxy Foxtrot is another one of them. And of course, I could not help myself but order a super parrot. So what I loved about b.a.r.e was that they managed to keep their bulb prices relatively consistent. Now, the trade-off for something like a Columbus is that I have to order 700 bulbs versus the typical 500 bulbs. But when I do that, my Columbus actually comes out to 34 cents a bulb, which is really, really reasonable, right? My Foxy Foxtrot, which only comes in the 500 increments, cost me 39 cents. The Super Parrots are 39 cents, but very, very reasonable bulb pricing in my view. Now, when I go down to the b.a.r.e order, which is the one that I said is in 100 quantity increments, I'm paying a little bit more for those bulbs, right? I'm paying 59 cents for the Dream Touch. This is the most expensive bulb on my list, but I did also order some Apricot Impression, which is a single, for 39 cents. So at the end of the day, things do balance out. And then when I now take into account what I ordered from the Tulip workshop, the Ad Rem and the Alibi were non-pre-cool that I picked up directly from the farm on my way back. And those were also reasonable at 40 cents and 36 cents a bulb. Because remember, like, there is now another middleman there, right? The facilitators of the Tulip workshops are now selling to someone else there. And then I bought the pre-cool bulbs that they literally got on a container ship on their own, did all the paperwork and all that stuff. I bought some Allison Bradley and some Cabana. They, I've obviously never grown them, but they look fantastic, so I can't wait for them to come. And they ended up being 51 cents a bulb. So I also thought that was pretty reasonable. Now, what I did was I did something called weighted average to figure out, based off of the quantity that I bought of each and the price of each, how much was my average bulb price, and it comes out to 40 cents a bulb. Again, without shipping here. With shipping, I would expect that to go up by another 3 to 5 cents at most for each of the bulbs, since I'm ordering in such high quantities. Now, one thing to note here is that if you're field planting, you're probably going to get most of them coming around the same time. So it is possible for you to take all these varieties and potentially work with them at the same time, especially if you are going to have a cooler or something like that to hold the blooms. But because I am forcing, there's a little bit more science and timing behind it, meaning that different varieties are going to have different required weeks of cooling. I am not going to have all these varieties to play with at the same time. So that's why when I order in my mind, right, I'm ordering 300 bulbs from b.a.r.e. I'm expecting all these bulbs to have the same amount of, or to have finished their cooling, even though they're different varieties. I'm going to try to force them for Valentine's Day. Then I say to myself, okay, like if I only have 3 varieties, I need to balance it out with at least a single, with something that's a double, and maybe another single to make it work for me, right? So it's almost like I had that step back in terms of saying, like, what am I willing to pay per bulb average price, and I zoom in to say, okay, like I expect to force all of these at the same time. I expect to now force these at the same time. And what does that average cost per bulb look like in those specific situations? Because otherwise I'll end up with bouquets that are technically worth more during one forcing period versus another forcing period, right? And if they're the same customers, they might be like, like what's wrong? Like, I don't think a customer is actually going to realize, because most of these varieties are varieties that they've never seen. But like, it's something that I am just mindful of. So I'm growing 5,700 total bulbs. I don't have enough infrastructure, crates, or cooling space to be able to do all of that in terms of forcing. So a good half of that is going to have to go out into the field. And I'm the type of person who crosses the bridge when I get there. So I will probably be planting 3,000 bulbs during Thanksgiving, which is totally fine. But from a harvesting perspective, I am a little bit intimidated, because now we get to my last section, which is considerations, right? The number one consideration you need to have is you need a cooler or a refrigerator or something of that sort. There are people who start growing mass quantities of tulips with zero cooling infrastructure, and that is a big no-no. The only way you can get away with that is if you have a very ready market. You are able to harvest, bunch them up, and basically get them out of your place. So that is the only exception, but I can't imagine someone being like me in a first, second, third year flower farming situation that they have that kind of demand already, right? And if you have that kind of demand, then you should probably be growing more with a cooling infrastructure to be able to push them out. So I say this because, a regular fridge can actually fit quite a bit, especially if you're going to be dry storing them. They will look a little bit wilted, but you can rehydrate them and they'll come back to life and it will have no impact on a day's life. But I can't fit 3,000 into a fridge. So again, I will cross that bridge when I get to it. But the goal for me is if I could force at least 2,000 tulip bulbs and get them out in the winter, I will have more than made back my investment in bulbs. And a part of next year for me is less about making money. Like, I obviously want to recoup the cost of all of my bulbs. I mean, when I look at how much I spent $2,260 without shipping for all of my bulbs, right? I definitely want to recoup that. But what I really want to do is understand, if I'm able to successfully force them in the winter, and really just understanding like what that demand is when I have that amount of quantity, because we are in the process of building a detached garage for our own personal use. We need to fit equipment. Like, we have a very, very big lawnmower that is currently sitting in our normal garage, and we work out in our garage. So we actually need space for a detached garage. And if all goes well here, I am going to plan to have a little cooler section in that garage dedicated for tulip forcing. So I have the space in my basement to actually grow the tulips, but I need a place to cool the tulips. And so I'm trying to figure out, is it worth investing that money in terms of the detached garage infrastructure for me to do it? So that's why I'm going all in on tulip bulbs this year. I hope this video was helpful for you. I hear all the time questions around, are tulips really that profitable? And my answer to everyone is always, anything can be profitable, right? It is a matter of you balancing what your cost is versus what your revenue is. And if you understand how to control your costs and what your upper limit and even what your lower limit of what you can fetch in terms of revenue, then you can typically make an educated decision as to whether or not you will make money. It's not guaranteed to make money, but you can say with a certain level of confidence or certainty that you should be able to make money. And so if there's anything you could take away from this video here, it is tulips can be profitable, assuming you have a cooler, assuming you are not overpaying for your bulbs, and assuming that you are able to charge, I would say, at least $1.50 to $2 a stem, right? If you can hit all those three components, then go ahead, plant tulips and try to plant at least 500 to really get an idea for what that looks like, right? So anyway, let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. I'm really excited for tulip season. I hope you are too, and I will see you next time.